Thank you for checking out another Jose Productions video. In this one, we're going to take a look at why South Carolina, had the distinction of being the only North American mainland colony of England to have a slave majority population. And we're also going to take a look at why North Carolina and South Carolina got into a big old fight. It separated into two Carolinas. Now this story cannot begin without telling you a little bit about a guy by the name of Charles in Charge.
Charles in charge of our days and our nights.
Now, Charles II wasn't always in charge. In fact, England was going through a bloody period of civil war, and when he retakes the throne in 1660, this is the so-called Restoration period, the restoration of the Stuart monarchs. And when Charles II takes the throne in 1660, he goes on with a mission of rewarding those individuals who helped him and his family regain the monarchy. Now, important point to keep in mind is, during this period, these restoration colonies are going to be formed. The Carolinas are going to be one of them. And he has some goals beyond just hooking up his friends, and that is, if you recall, there was a concern in England about the Spanish presence in North America. Spain had established its permanent settlement at St. Augustine. Its empire had grown quite large, and there was a fear that if they don't colonize, England doesn't colonize this area, that perhaps Virginia was going to be threatened, or other areas of their empire. And so part of the motive of establishing the Carolinas is to show Spain, we're not afraid.
I'm not afraid.
Yeah. It's been a ride.
We're going to take a stand, and the Carolinas would be a defense against Spanish Florida. And as a reward for 8 guys who helped him regain the throne, they get rewarded with a charter these men.
Men.
And they become known as the Lord Proprietors of Carolina. They get this land in 1663. Now, the charter basically says that they have to follow certain guidelines, but they have the power and the liberty to go off and claim this territory as a proprietary colony. And remember, this is different than a joint stock company. This is a huge land grant given to a group of individuals. There are the handsome fellows right below. Now, it doesn't turn out perfectly right away. In fact, in 1665, they add a little bit more land. And when the colony is finally established in 1670, they name it the harbor Charlestown in honor of King Charles II. And they have some troubles in the beginning. They have a very close relationship with the British colonies in the West Indies. We're talking colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. And really, a lot of the people from the West Indies were the first people to colonize the Carolinas. And there was this idea that they were going to grow food for the very prosperous, wealthy, sugar-producing colonies that England had in the West Indies. They tried growing some things. They tried growing, tobacco and grapes and cotton and things of this nature, but they don't have much luck. And if anything, there's some brutal history in this period because the colonists start rounding up native people and sending them off to slavery to places like the West Indies. But they don't have, still, a thing that's going to draw settlers into the colony until rice becomes the hugely profitable cash crop of the colony. And it grows very well in especially the climate of what is South Carolina, this kind of very moist, swampy, low country that becomes the center of the rice plantations in South Carolina. Now, the thing about rice is it is a very labor-intensive product. And if you're wondering, now who's going to do the labor? And it's not going to be indentured servants like we saw in Virginia. By this point, by the 1670s, 80s, 90s, and the 1700s, indentured servitude's kind of losing its appeal over in England. So they turn to, of course, a very brutal other labor system.
Welcome to slavery.
And slavery is going to be hugely important in the Carolina plantation economy. It is going to be slave labor working the rice fields. And there's a couple of reasons why slaves, especially slaves from rice-growing West African countries, are going to be very, very sought after. People from West Africa had already grown accustomed to cultivating rice. They had immunity to malaria, which was a big problem in this part of the country at the time. And so these individuals from West Africa were highly sought after. And in fact, you could see this when looking at the advertisements trying to bring forth slaves into the colony. They openly celebrated and advertised the fact that certain slaves were coming from rice-growing regions, and therefore they would fetch top dollar. So the institution of slavery plays a huge role in the development of Carolina. They also tried growing other things, we'll get to that in just a moment, but by 1710, African slaves were the majority of the population of South Carolina. All of the other colonies had slavery, but South Carolina is going to rely on it much more. And as I said, they did grow other things. Indigo is kind of important, nowhere near the level of rice, and it was a plant that was used to make a natural blue dye. And at the time, there was no synthetic blue dyes, so it was very, very sought after and very, very profitable. Now, what ends up happening is the colony now has its cash crops, rice, indigo, and the colony is growing. But with that growth comes conflict with Spain. Spain does not like this British colony, this Protestant colony so close to its borders, and you have border raids taking place where Spain is trying to wipe out the Carolina settlement. However, by 1700, the Spanish threat is no longer quite serious. The colony is growing very, very rapidly. In fact, Charleston is becoming one of the most busiest ports in the southern part of the British Empire. And Charleston was a very cosmopolitan city. There were tons of people coming in. There was religious toleration in the colony, so you had all sorts of different groups of people coming into this region. And how do you get to? Where does North Carolina come from? Well, the reality was these two regions, this part of Southern Carolina and North Carolina, were very different from one another. And the people that were going into this area of North Carolina, or what would become North Carolina, were largely people from the Virginia colony that were down on their luck. They were people who were squatters. They had no right to the land. They just basically set up little small farms. There is no large plantation economy in this part of the settlement because the land doesn't really allow for that. And so what you get is, eventually, as these two regions are growing very different from one another because of the geography and other factors, you get the emergence of two Carolinas. In 1712, North and South Carolina are officially separated from one another following some problems with some government officials. And North Carolina is going to be very different than South Carolina. It's not going to have all this, plantation rice economy, very, very limited reliance on slavery. In fact, it's going to share some characteristics with another colony, Rhode Island, very democratic, very independent-minded, no huge landed elite, and it's going to be amongst the least aristocratic of the original 13 colonies. That's the lecture on the Carolina colonies. Those are the terms that you should know and the ideas and the things that you should study if you're an APUSH student or just someone getting ready for Jeopardy. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to Joe's Productions. And as always, have a beautiful night. Peace.